Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we go through some somewhat startling numbers and some team defensive numbers that have jumped out through the first week of Bucks basketball. We preview another big matchup with the Memphis Grizzlies, and spoiler alert, another game without Khris Middleton. We get into it after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen each and every day. Free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube as well, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And your favorite podcast now has a newsletter as we introduce the Locked On Bucks Daily Newsletter, your one-stop shop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free now at lockedondaily.com, lockedondaily.com, and start your day with all the new free Locked On Bucks information you need from the Locked On Bucks newsletter. Today's episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Start the season with a big return on FanDuel as new customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So, Camille, I guess we'll start there. We were waiting to see, it's going to be around 5 that we'll see the Bucks have to submit their first injury report for this Thursday game in Memphis. So maybe we'll know. Maybe Khris Middleton will be listed as questionable. He's not. He is already listed as out. So it is yet another game that the Bucks will be playing without Khris Middleton. I don't know what your daily schedule is when the Bucks lose. Do you consume as much NBA content as you typically would?
Not as much unless it's something like beginning of the year. Like right now, I'm still consuming a lot of content just because it's new. But generally, after a loss, it's just like let me kind of look at the numbers and let me avoid some of the national podcasts. Like I can't hear getting clowned on for a whole segment here.
Well, that's all you're gonna hear. I listened to some today, and it felt like the scene in The Office where Jim is just purposely trying to troll Dwight and is talking about, I think, Battlestar Galactica and just touting all these things that are inaccurate. And you can see Dwight just fuming and waiting to chime in and tell him he's incorrect. Like some of what I've heard is that's not true. Like I don't know where we're pulling this from, but it's what's going to happen when you're 1-3 and when things look as they do. We didn't really get into this part of the discussion, but I know it's kind of spread on a lot of national shows. And we kind of tiptoed around it, but didn't rip the Band-Aid off. And that's, the panic meter and which teams are you more concerned about with these slow starts, albeit a week. The Bucks have been lumped in with the Nuggets quite a bit. And, even coming into the season, I think we had the conversation of, man, these two teams are kind of doppelgangers when you think about how things have gone since they won a title and the Jokic and Giannis thing and their pairings. The age of Jokic and Jamal Murray when they won the title versus Giannis and Khris Middleton, like it just seemed like a perfect fit. And now you see the Denver Nuggets at 2-2 with their 2 wins, both overtime wins against bad teams where Nikola Jokic needed to score 40 points. I think he's already matched his number of 40-point games from a year ago, 4 games into the season. Look, I'm not saying it's a great spot for the Bucks to be in, but I still feel better about where the Bucks are than I would the Nuggets, if for no other reason than we keep pointing to, well, yet another game with no Khris Middleton. He's eventually going to come back. Like, I don't know what the savior is for Denver. And that's not to put all the savior, the title of it on Khris Middleton, but you at least have that you can cling to and point to if you're the Bucks.
Yeah, at least you do have that to point to of saying like, hey, we got another main piece coming back in our lineup. It should change a bit our rotation and how we can attack things. So that is a difference. But one thing about the Denver start that's been really interesting, because for years, the talk about the Nuggets has been just around the bench. Like the bench, year after year, it's getting weaker, it's getting weaker, it's getting weaker. And in Denver, they're like, well, we think we have the young guys who we can plug and play into the lineup and that will be able to withstand losing a Bruce Brown, losing a KCP, and we can continue to move forward with it. And even though a lot of the Denver rotation currently was on that team last year, you have guys who are in different roles. So there's an acclimation period of getting used to playing with certain guys at different times in the game with more minutes, different combinations, different lineups. So there is always going to be that acclimation period, which when I look at the Bucks, something that I kind of lean on where I'm like, okay, again, a lot of the same faces here, but there are some new key pieces for the Bucks here, like Gary Trent Jr., a new starting shooting guard. You've had Taurean Prince in the game as the de facto starting three with Khris Middleton out as well. So there's always going to be that acclimation period for teams. So for the Bucks, I do think that's part of it. Because like we said yesterday too, there are times in the game where you can just see guys are just thinking someone's going to be somewhere and they're not. They have to get used to playing with each other. So again, it's early in the season for Denver as well as just as it is for Milwaukee.
Yeah.
But I have quite a few more questions about Denver right now than Milwaukee. And I don't know if that makes me feel great about Milwaukee or if that's just a case of like, hey, they might have it a little bit worse than what you have going on, or this could be just what you're going to see here eventually as well.
Or if it makes you feel like am I just burying my head in the sand and I'm oblivious to like the call is coming from inside the house? Like,
right,
is that
right.
what we're reaching here? Look, there's nothing really new to add on the Khris Middleton front. We don't know when he's going to play. We know it's not going to be in Memphis against the Grizzlies. You hope it's this weekend because 2 games against the Cleveland Cavaliers, who look like world beaters so far, like that is going to be a challenge. But I guess hopefully we don't have to do this beyond next week, but we'll just leave it with this. Have you reached a level of concern yet for Khris Middleton and his availability?
No, not yet. It's a marathon. It's a marathon. We got a lot of season left. I saw that Doc Rivers was mentioning that, he looked good. He's getting close. And here we go again with close. He's getting close. He's getting close. At least Doc this time said, like, I don't have a timeline, but like he's getting
he said
close.
that last time too.
You know what? You're right. So we just got to wait and see at this point. Because again, if we're having this conversation, if we're mid-November, and we're still like, well, where is Khris Middleton at? Then it's kind of like, okay, what's happening? But right now, a couple games into the season still, I would love if he could be able to return for one of those Cleveland games just because of what the Cavaliers have been doing. And that's a team that's really impressed me early on so far in the season, even though the first few wins were against like lottery teams, but seeing what they did against the Knicks, and they're currently playing with the Lakers right now and looking pretty good. So a lot of respect for Cleveland, but that's, ideally, if he could come back at a time, I would love for it to be for one of those 2 games, if not both of them. But again, at this moment of recording, we're still on the loose timeline from Doc Rivers of there is no timeline, but it's close. How about you? Are you feeling the concern yet?
No, not yet. And I know we both said, I don't know what the exact date is that I would be concerned. I'll know it when we hit there. I'm not there yet, but and I assure you, this isn't like the parent that's just putting up the brave face to keep their children comfortable. I'm not there yet, but I think what complicates it is their record. And like, man, if you really start to lose some ground here, like, what if they're 1-6? What if they're 1-8, something like that, or 2-8 to start the season? It still doesn't amplify my concern for Khris Middleton. It just kind of raises where's this team going to finish in the standings if you're still waiting for him to get back? And then you assume there's going to be some lumps even when he comes back, because that's when you're going to install the offense and he has to learn how to play with Gary Trent and all the other new faces. So that's where I'm at. And it seems like we're pretty well aligned there. Speaking of level of concern, through 4 games, I was able to pull some numbers that at the very least, they elevate your blood pressure and make you raise an eyebrow with this team and seemingly what stands out the most for this 1-3 start to the season. So we'll get into some very, very concerning numbers coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Well, let's talk to you now about our friends over at FanDuel as you get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL, all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, and do it all on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports book partner of the NFL. All right, Camille, these concerning numbers here. I pulled, let's see, the gist of it is 5 areas, I'll say. So let's go with A, B, C, D, or E. Which one would you like to start with?
Of course, I'm going to say C for Camille. So let's go with C.
Okay, 3-point shooting.
Okay.
Bucks opponents are taking 42% of their shots from 3 so far this season. That is 4 percentage points above what the league average is, and it is the 7th highest rate in the league. Now, certainly the Boston Celtics are, last year was 50%, I think, that they took there. They're taking even more threes this year. They were averaging 50 per game. So that's going to skew it a little bit. But we saw the Chicago Bulls put up a heavy volume of threes, the Brooklyn Nets as well. It's been 45 or more 3-point attempts in 3 straight games that the Bucks have given up here. So what do you make of that? Is it as simple as the perimeter defense? Is it a stretch of, just bad luck, and you're going to see this from time to time? Is it the Celtics skewing that, even though we just said 3 straight opponents with 45 or more? What is your main takeaway from that?
I mean, again, we say this a lot, but it's a small sample size here for this team. And the Celtics going up against them can definitely inflate that. The Chicago Bulls are a team that seem to be more invested as well of getting those threes.
In fairness, they took a lot more threes in their next game too.
Yeah, they took 53 against Memphis in their last game as well. So they are looking to get them up. So they have played 2 teams, we can say for sure, that have a shot profile of just putting up a lot of threes. The Brooklyn Nets, we've said it before, but a lot of times, quote unquote, bad teams, they know like, hey, we just don't get a lot of shots up. We're going to get a lot of threes up. That's a great equalizer. So let's get these shots up. So you can see that happen from time to time as well. Now, what I would be concerned about is if as we get, midway through November, if that's a trend that continues, because then it looks like something of opponents are like, hey, the Bucks are weak defending at the 3-point line. We are going to have an emphasis on trying to get these shots up. So it's something to keep an eye on for sure. But right now it's like you've played a couple of opponents who love to get them up, but the Bucks have to do better at defending them as well and also running guys off the line.
2 other things that I think tie into that. I think we talked about this on a recent show. The Bucks are allowing almost 11 corner 3 attempts to their opponents. Yeah, it's 14% higher than what the league average is. Only the Heat and Kings give up more attempts from the corner through the first week of the season at 5, basically, from both of those teams. So that is way too many, and that needs to come down. And I think tying into what we're seeing with the influx of 3-point attempts against the Bucks is the percentage of shots opponents are taking at the rim is about the same, a little lower. Again, it's 4 games, but a little lower than it's been in recent years. But opponents are finding a lot more success through these first 4 games that either that's the defense out of position, when you mentioned it on yesterday's show, seeing Brook Lopez still having to recover and get out to the corners and contest threes, whether it's a part of that, of Brook Lopez in scramble mode and just attacking from there, or if it's just higher quality shots. But that's an area the Bucks have traditionally dominated, not only a low volume of shot attempts there. Opponents were shooting under 50% for a while from the rim, which, is remarkable because that's the easiest shot there is. And this year it's about 65% that opponents are converting at. So that is another one that I think they all kind of tie together, but certainly very, very troubling. Let's go with another one that sticks with the defense. Transition defense. I know you and Frank have talked about this. I think you and I were talking about it on a recent show as well. But the Bucks have basically, and this is, what we've seen since Doc Rivers took over, they have done a much better job of reducing the amount of possessions that opponents are getting in transition. I mean, last year it was way too high. They were last in terms of, the most, or in the bottom 5 to 10 for most of the season until Doc took over. So far, they're at about league average. That's good, right? The bad. Opponents have a 150 offensive rating in transition against the Bucks. That remarkably is not last. It is second to last in the league. And when it's coming off a live ball turnover, it's a near 190 offensive rating. So in other words, guaranteed points. This is going off of how many points are you going to score in 100 opportunities. If it's 190, you're scoring 95% of the time. So that has been a huge problem, and it certainly matches the eye test that we've seen from this team.
It truly does. And a lot of it is some things that we have talked about before with this team, which is one, just got to cut down on the turnovers because you're putting yourself in a disadvantageous situation at that point. You got to clean that up. And something that Doc Rivers has pointed out, he said it last year, he said it again this year, but sometimes too, the offense can be just bad for your defense as well. If you're taking bad shots and you're going to be put in positions where it's harder for you to get back, you're going to set yourself up for some failure in that regards too. So for the Bucks, that's an area that we've been keeping an eye on, especially knowing that there were some teams that would get out and run on the Bucks, even after makes, where it's like, okay, listen, the ball coming out, we're taking it out, but we're going to run down the court as quickly as possible. You've seen a little bit of that, not as much as we have last year, but again, the competition is different. Like I'm thinking of the Pacers, for an example, a team that is infamous for doing that at this point. But the Bucks, again, clean up on the turnovers a bit. And they seem to come in bunches for this team as well. Like I think of the Celtics game where they were doing really well in that first quarter. And towards the end, you started seeing some cracks in the just ball security. And it was like in bunches. So for them to try to clean that up a bit, make sure that their shot selection on offense isn't going to set them up negatively defensively as well, and continue to move forward from that.
Yeah. I mean, the Celtics game too, it seemingly kind of started with that DeLon Wright when I don't know what it was, if it was Bobby Portis just kind of drifting into him or if it was DeLon Wright moving into Bobby. But regardless, when those two just kind of converged and he had that turnover, it was kind of like quicksand, and we saw more and more coming immediately after that. Okay, I'm going to skip one of these because it's probably more of a visual that's better served in written form than us just talking about it in an audio podcast or on YouTube. I mean, I assume it's going to remain for at least a couple of games that we can get to it at some point. But the other two that really stand out to me, and again, all of this stuff matches the eye test that we've seen from this team. Third quarters. Again, it's been the good and the bad. The Bucks have been the second best team in terms of their point production and scoring and effectiveness on the offensive side in third quarters. They're averaging 33 points per game. It's great. We're coming out of the locker room. The offense, maybe it was just coached up again. It's clicking, and all right, this is where we can extend our lead or come back. Not so fast, because the defense has just been atrocious in third quarters. I mean, that's where all of these issues are really stemming from. Dead last in defensive rating in those third quarters at a 142.2 and a net rating that is nearly negative 13. I mean, I don't want to make too much out of one quarter versus the others, but the fact that this is coming after you've had a 15-minute break in halftime and where seemingly you're making adjustments and everything else, that's the most, I suppose you'd say, concerning thing about those numbers.
Yeah, during the Celtics broadcast, there was a graphic that flashed up about the Bucks offense in particular in the third and the fourth quarter. So in addition to the defense lacking a bit in the third quarter, I shouldn't say a bit, just given the numbers you just put out there, but with the defense lacking in the third quarter, what you've also seen is in the fourth quarter, the Bucks offense tends to take a step back. And they were saying that offensively in the third quarter, the Bucks, you mentioned 35 points a quarter. It's really good, tied for first at the time when they pulled the numbers. The field goal percentage was tied for first. 3-point percentage was really up there, top three. Assists, they were up there, tied for first. But the fourth quarter, you see them in the bottom third of the league, like points per quarter. They were tied for 27th. Field goal percentage, they were 27th. 3-point field goal percentage, they were 26th. Assists, they were tied for 22nd in the fourth quarter. So in addition to seeing the defense struggle in the third quarter, what you're seeing as well is the offense has not been great in the fourth quarter when it's time to close. And one thing that we got used to with the Bucks last year was like, oh, it's clutch time.
Yeah.
They're good in the clutch. Not saying that they've been put in a whole bunch of clutch situations necessarily, but the performance in the fourth quarter offensively has been poor. In the third quarter, offense has been great, but the defense has suffered as well. So they have to clean up that second half of play for them. I'm not sure if part of it is, still getting to the season and getting their conditioning up and then just running out of gas or what, but they have got to clean that up.
Yeah, I didn't even look it up, and I'm going to try to do it now, but I would guess the Bucks have had none of those clutch situations so far.
Yeah, because it's been
comfortably
the bench coming in, like the garbage time bench at the end of the last couple of games.
They were comfortably ahead in Philly. I mean, they weren't seemingly the closest they got. It was around 9 against the Celtics. It felt like that was kind of the same deal with the Bulls. That would really be the only one where you would have it. So I'm going to go back and check that, but I would assume they either haven't had any of those situations or very few in that game against the Chicago Bulls.
Mm-hmm.
There's one other number that really stands out, and I think it deserves its own space. So we're going to save that for after the break because of the importance of this number and everyone involved. So we will tell you what that is coming up next year on Locked On Bucks. So the final number of all of these, granted, it's 1 weekend, but not the types of stats you want to see here through the first week of the season for the Bucks, is the pairing of Giannis and Damian Lillard. So I think we were talking about this previously about, again, the eye test and what we've seen from this group. Here's another one, sort of related to the number I'm about to throw out now, but the Bucks starting 5 of Dame, Gary Trent Jr., Taurean Prince, Giannis, and Brook Lopez. That group has played the second most possessions of any 5-man lineup in the league so far this season. Last year, we kept thumping our chest and touting how good the Bucks starting 5 was. And this is what gives you optimism. Granted, there's no Khris Middleton in this group. But last year, even those 3 guys, Giannis, Dame, and Brook Lopez, you had those, any iteration of a 5-man lineup centered around those 3 guys, you were pretty good. This year, your starters have played the second most possessions together in the league. And they have a net rating of 2. Oof. That is basically in the 50th percentile, middle of the pack in the league. So that is another one that is just simply not good enough. And again, you expect the numbers to go up when Khris Middleton makes his return. But even with 3/5 of that group before, we saw much better numbers a year ago. And it's 4 games. It's 150 possessions that we're talking about. So you don't want to freak out too much. But that was another one that you see and you just think, wait a minute. This kind of lines up with what I've seen so far through 4 games.
It has, where it's like, it just doesn't seem like it's actually clicking all the way for the starting group yet. And again, part of it can be acclimation period, given the fact that there's 2 new starters in the lineup with Dame and Giannis and Brook right now, given the fact that Khris isn't out there, but it's still something that you would hope is performing a bit better, given the fact that this is your starting group of guys. This is the group of guys that you were going to lean on. I mean, we heard Doc Rivers in the Boston game say, hey, the bench didn't have it. Our starters had it. So I wanted to extend their minutes a bit and just continue to ride what they were able to do. So to see the numbers and say like they're performing really averagely at this point is a little concerning. And it's like, well, what can they do to fix that a little bit? And I mean, more reps will definitely help. I think finding ways to get Gary Trent Jr. some more opportunities to score would also be good for them. And just getting that chemistry together. So yeah, that number is a little concerning to me. And again, understanding that Khris Middleton is going to come in and he's going to be in that starting lineup. We've talked about not wanting Taurean Prince to be playing as many minutes this season as he had to for the Lakers last year, having him in more of just a true role player role. But he's been called into the starting duty. So that affects things a bit, but I think that's a little concerning overall.
So the last thing to point out here kind of ties into that, and that is what we've seen from Giannis. And when I say only Giannis, I mean without Dame. So maybe Brooks on the floor with him, maybe Gary Trent Jr., and same for Damian Lillard. But just looking at those two guys individually, when Damian Lillard is on the floor and Giannis is not, and when Giannis is on the floor and Damian Lillard is not. Again, very small sample size. We're talking about like roughly 90 possessions for both of these examples, which is essentially one game that we're talking about here. But still, with Damian Lillard on the floor and Giannis off, the Bucks have posted a 126.4 offensive rating, which is really good. It's far beyond better than 10 points per 100 possessions, about 15 per 100 possessions, better than where their overall offensive rating is so far. And a 113.2 defensive rating, which is in the 91st percentile. And granted, and I think a few people pointed this out, and it's true, but so what? Yeah, but Brook Lopez is going to be on the floor in basically all of those situations. And it is. Every single one of the lineups that we're looking at here, Brook is on the floor with Dame. But again, I think that backs up the chemistry that we have seen from day one, seemingly, between those two. When you flip it around, so in elite offense with Dame on the floor and Giannis off, in a more than good enough defense, like 113.2 in this day and age, that's pretty good.
Yeah, it is.
When it's Giannis and no Dame, it's a 102.5 offensive rating and a 124.1 defensive rating. Camille, they are in the second percentile in offense, the sixth percentile on defense, and in the lowest percentile in net rating at a negative 21.6. I mean, it's no surprise. It just doesn't feel like it's looked right when that's been what we've seen. And these numbers really back it up. Again, it's about a game's worth of data when we look at the overall amount of possessions that we're citing here. But still, it's a quarter of your season, essentially, is what we're looking at. And the numbers back up, I think, what we've all seen so far.
Those numbers definitely back up the eye test, because the first thing that comes to mind when hearing those numbers is thinking of those Giannis plus 4 bench player lineups where it's like, these are hard lineups and they just have not looked great, which I know is probably tanking that Giannis number a bit of just how many times he's done.
Yeah, I was going to say, and by the way, the one of that we've, or the two that we've seen the most have been brutal. When it's Giannis with Bobby, Pat Connaughton, not all bench, but Gary Trent Jr. and DeLon Wright, that's been horrendous. And the one that is all bench with Giannis that's been the worst is with Bobby, Pat Connaughton, AJ Green, and DeLon Wright. Like it's just been brutal in those. They're not getting stops and they're not scoring because everything is going to funnel. And this isn't a knock on Giannis too. Like I don't feel like we need to preface that. It's just saying, look, this isn't working. We got to figure something else out with the staggering. And I'm not saying you can't stagger Giannis and Dame. You have to. But I think it's examining, maybe it's Dame and the bench, right? Like we know Dame and Brook Lopez work well together. That's going to be part of your staggering. Giannis and Khris, that's going to be part of your staggering. I would advocate for Giannis and Gary Trent Jr., given his shooting ability and just continuing to jumpstart that chemistry and finding him. But that's the bigger takeaway. It's not to blame Giannis or say, hey, Dame's the greatest. It's just saying, okay, this hasn't worked so far. So how do we find a happy medium?
Could not agree more with that. That has to change for this team. And again, it takes us back to the first segment of this episode, talking about the Denver Nuggets and the bench, of saying like, there's been questions around the bench and there are questions around this Bucks bench and as well. And the fact that you don't have Khris Middleton and you're putting Taurean Prince into that starting lineup is taking one more guy who you can count on for that bench rotation and taking him out and putting him in the starting lineup. So it just changes the math for the Bucks a bit. But what they cannot continue to do going forward is that combination with Giannis plus the 4 bench guys. I do like Giannis with Gary Trent Jr., but the other pieces around them might have to be tweaked as well. I do like what you said too about maybe it's a bit more of Dame with the bench heavier units and letting him run the show with those guys. But yeah, they have to figure out a different combination because it's currently not working right now.
And I mean, this could be an episode in itself, and I'm sure we'll continue to have this conversation. Hopefully these numbers don't continue. Otherwise, this is going to be its own episode in examining that. But I mean, I think it's gonna look rough as long as Khris Middleton isn't there because of those groupings. When you think about, all these iterations of the lineup that we're talking about when it's Giannis and no Dame, this isn't a shot at DeLon Wright either, but it's much different with DeLon Wright as the initiator and the guy that's organizing the offense versus Damian Lillard. And when you have that, and then it's also AJ Green, who needs the open opportunities, which you're still going to get some on the floor with Giannis. It's much different when it's Giannis and Dame that you're on the floor with, or Giannis and Khris Middleton that you're on the floor with. AJ Green isn't going to create much of any offense off the dribble, right? So when it's that, and when it's Pat Connaughton, and we don't even need to get into it. I think all the comments are going to do it on their own with Pat Connaughton. But when it's that, I think it just makes it so much harder for Giannis to efficiently score and find those openings.
And honestly, too, Brook Lopez has been such a defensive anchor. I mean, we've talked about his defense for years at this point, but he's been really good for them defensively this year as well. So I do wonder if part of it is just that big combination of Giannis and Bobby just isn't going to cut it. And being able to, which you don't want to have Brook Lopez out here playing 35, 36 minutes consistently through the regular season. But right now, he has been like the defensive saving grace for the big rotation. And then you pair that in with the fact, as we mentioned, like just other bench players just have not been performing as well as you would have hoped. Pat Connaughton is a guy who I think we talked after the last show of like looking at his 3-point percentage. Like, we thought it was a bit higher than what it is after looking at the numbers, but just the combinations of guys as well. So I think part of it is just the defense being anchored with Bobby and Giannis has not been working. It has been working when Brook is out there more times than not. And then on top of that, too, just the ability to have the shot creation around Giannis. And these bench lineups hasn't been there as well when you're running out an AJ Green, a Pat Connaughton, outside of Gary Trent Jr., who might in those situations need to be somebody who has a higher usage in those lineups just to kind of even out the shot creation aspect to the lineups to kind of generate more offense as well.
And I mean, one last thing to basically back up everything that you just said, Camille. Giannis and Bobby on the floor together so far this season. We've gone over it a lot. Small sample size, yada, yada, yada. More possessions than we're talking about of Giannis individually with no Dame and vice versa, but still relatively low. Mm-hmm. A -35 net rating and a defensive rating of 133.6 when that is your back line of the defense. And even the offense is less than 100 for a net rating. So it has been brutal with those two. Brook and Dame on the floor together, it's been nearly 300 possessions. So like almost 3 games worth of data that we're seeing here. And they have a 120 offensive rating and a 113 defensive rating. So again, you have that backline defense in Brook Lopez. And we've seen from day one the chemistry that's been there because of how lethal Dame is coming off of screens and how good of a screen setter Brook Lopez is, that has been an instant fit, and the numbers continue to back that up.
Yeah, so it's going to raise some questions around just the rest of this Milwaukee Bucks team as we continue throughout the season and just watching the rotation because, as I mentioned, Pat Connaughton has been somebody who the play just hasn't been up to the level that it needs to be offensively and defensively as well, because on ball, Pat Connaughton trying to guard, the feet just seem a little bit too slow. Guys are able to turn the corner on him pretty easily as well. So in addition to that big rotation not being super stout defensively, you're having some perimeter defenders out there as well that aren't really able to hold up at the point of attack. So it's a lot of different combinations of things for this Bucks team. So the question is, would any of the young Bucks be able to step up into some of these roles, and will they yield a better result? And then also, I mean, the biggest piece is, of course, Khris Middleton coming back changes the rotations quite a bit. So you would count on that. But I don't like the idea of looking at Khris Middleton as the savior for all of the current problems for the Bucks. They have to do some soul searching and figure some things out, because this is not going to be good enough. If it is a whole seat, like if this turns out to be how it looks throughout the season, it's not going to be good enough.
Last thing here, we've answered the question, Camille. The Bucks have not had any clutch situations so far this season. There are 2 teams that have not been in the clutch so far. The Bucks are one of those 2 teams. So in the past, that would be a good thing I mean, the Bucks are just
Rolling
rolling,
them
but
out.
that has not been the case
No.
so far. So hopefully we see much better things starting later on today when the Bucks are in Memphis to take on the Grizzlies. We'll have one more show this week recapping that game in Memphis, and then two very big games next week, this weekend and next week, home against the Cavaliers and then in Cleveland Monday night for game number 2 against the Cavaliers. That will do it for today's show. For Camille, I'm Justin. We will talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.